Welcome to Spotlight on Schools. We focus on the Rochester City School District. I'm your host, Jim Strauss. Today I want to talk with my guest about the Rochester School Board and Superintendent Bolgan Vargas's plan for the district. One source that has provided regular information about the school district that doesn't appear in other news outlets is City Newspaper. On the front page, it calls itself Greater Rochester's Alternative News Weekly. If you read through an issue, you'll see that most of it's about reviews and entertainment. You may find some language and some ads that might not appear in the mainstream press. But you'll also see towards the front of each issue many articles that demonstrate a serious concern for Rochester, for its politics, for its business, and for the state of its schools. It's my pleasure to welcome City Newspaper staff education writer Tim Louis Macaluso. Welcome to Spotlight on Schools.
Well, thank you for having me.
Okay, when I hear the term Alternative News Weekly, I think back to my days in the 60s and 70s and the rise of the alternative press, decidedly liberal, decidedly anti-establishment. When I read the columns of your publisher, Mariana Toller, I definitely see a viewpoint that could be labeled progressive or populist, and if a conservative read it, he'd probably certainly label it liberal. But your articles seem objective. You don't seem to make judgments, you seem to make observations. That runs counter to much journalism today, which has moved toward niches, that is preaching to choirs. So I have two questions. Have I characterized Ms. Toller correctly, and have I characterized you correctly?
Well, I would say, I don't want to speak for Mariana, but I would say that progressive is, she's got progressive views. The paper does lean toward a progressive viewpoint. And I would say less populous, but certainly, you know, there's no argument that we are a liberal paper. Oddly enough, we have quite a few conservative readers. You probably, I know it runs contrary to the way people think, but you know, I would say we have a significant number of conservative readers, and the way the publication is distributed, it's free. And so people who, say, work in the city can pick up the paper and take it home with them, or they can pick it up out in the suburbs. We're out in the entire Rochester region, so you know, if you know the demographics and you know the politics of this area, there is a liberal core to Rochester, but some parts of the suburbs are quite conservative. So there's a cross-pollination there.
Yeah, and you can tell that you have a wide readership, across the political spectrum, because you see the readers, the letters to the editor.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We hear from them, and sometimes we are corrected, sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't agree, and we just agree not to agree. Now,
your approach in your articles seems a little bit more cautious, shall we say, than some of these the viewpoints on where the city should be going. How would you comment?
I would say, you know, I'm not a fan of what some people would describe as gotcha type journalism. I really try to be fair. I try to see both points of view, but there is a voice there. There's definitely a viewpoint, but it's not to skewer one person's viewpoint or another. It's really to present. It's really to provide analysis, some kind of understanding, because many of the subjects that we talk about are complex, and that's one of the things that differentiates a weekly, an alternative weekly like City, from, say, the dailies. The dailies their job is to report on a daily basis what's happening. XYZ happened today. We take a step backward and we look at what does that really mean to the community, and try to present it that way.
Okay. You have been covering what's been happening in the Rochester City School District for a while now. You said you've been with the paper 10 years.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. This past January saw school board member Van White challenge incumbent Malik Evans for leadership of the board. You predicted that Malik Evans was going to win. That was an easy prediction, and he did. Yeah. Okay. In an article entitled "Leadership Fight for the Rochester School Board," I have it right here. You characterize these two candidates as having different approaches to the position. Can you summarize what you said about each of them? We'll start with Malik Evans.
Well, I've covered Malik for quite a while, and their approaches are different. Malik is Malik has a tendency to allow the group to sort of coalesce around an idea. When he was interviewing with us prior to the last round of elections, we talked to him about leading from trying to be the person who builds the consensus and going forward from there. And he said that he had actually tried to do that at different times, but it just wasn't an approach that really worked for him, and it also didn't seem to be really productive for him. And what he did describe was more of an approach that was seeing where the group really stood, and sometimes from there he might even be the deciding vote on where that issue would fall. Van's approach is a little bit different, and I think if you put into context his background as an attorney, attorneys have to argue a case, and they build a story around a case, and they try to persuade a jury or they try to persuade a judge to take that point of view. And so some of that training comes out in him, and he is much more likely to be very strong in his viewpoints and try to persuade people in that way. But they're both good approaches, and I think what was striking to me about that whole issue was that they have both been strong allies of each other through a lot of different issues that have come before the board. And so that's what really made it interesting, is just that these two men have very powerful thinking, very strong views, and usually we're on the same side. So this was a little different.
Okay, in your article you said this. I want to read you back a quote you wrote, and here it is. The problem for Evans and White is that the board's relationship with its past superintendents hasn't always been productive. There's also disagreement over the board's role. Now you posit here two different approaches. One, policymakers with a light hand of supervision of the superintendent, or this is the opposite, a more hands-on role defining the superintendent's objectives and specifying how they should be reached. You go on to say some school board members complain they don't always have control over many of the superintendent's decisions, but they, the board, receive the angry calls from parents and residents. And I think this is a good question, one I've asked myself. Who is in charge here? Who sets the agenda? Who determines the direction? Or perhaps even better, who should? The board, the superintendent?
Well, they both have a role. They both have a job. The board's role their first job is to hire and to supervise the superintendent. And to create policy and to approve policy. They obviously have a financial oversight role. I think the question comes into how far into the weeds they go. There are people on school boards, on this school board, that will say that they should be able to actually go as far as to hire or to interview or to approve teachers. Now, other people would say that's going a little too far. So, it's a matter of degrees. And I think one of the things that's really important about a successful school district is just how well these two bodies work together. Because it's not just the superintendent, it's the superintendent's cabinet and staff, and then it's also the board. And there are some board members who are no longer on that particular board at this particular time have complained that in the past there has been separation. There has been an effort to not always give the board the information that they need in a timely way, and things like that. So,
are we talking about Alan Williams?
No.
Oh, further back.
Yeah, further than that. But in any case, they do have different roles, and I think the idea is to try and get them to work together as much as possible.
Okay, well, we're going to take a break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about the revolution that Van White had called for. Don't go away. We'll come right back. Thank you. Welcome back to Spotlight on Schools. We're talking with Tim Louis Macaluso, the education staff writer for City Newspaper. We've been talking about the school board and in particular Van White. In October, you reviewed a document that Van White presented to the superintendent and the board. This was your story, White's Revolution, and the document was called "We're Beyond Reform, It's Time for a Revolution." In it, he called for some sweeping changes. Your story outlines some of them, and here they are. The more moderate ones: restore reading teachers in elementary schools, return the district to neighborhood schools, extend the school year 2 to 4 weeks into the summer. Some of the more bolder ones: holding nonpartisan school board elections, approaching neighboring suburban districts about accepting kindergarten through third grade children into their schools. This is part of the deconcentration of poverty. Calling on area colleges to create high schools on their campuses. Which of those do you want to talk about?
Well, I think that this is classic Van White. I mean, he's very much an idea person. He's always pitching ideas, and he's probably had more of a track record in terms of promoting policies and getting his policies approved on the board. And he is my first encounters with Van had to do with graduation rates, and he was one of the first people to really bring so much attention to graduation rates and the push to try and bump those graduation rates up. So this is kind of an extension of that in many ways. And the issue that I think is the most fascinating is a recognition that the concentration of poverty does have an effect on city students, and the idea of possibly trying to break up that concentration of poverty to some extent is, I think, an interesting one, and it's been attempted. In the most extreme form, it would be metro schools, which is very unlikely for us, but many people see that as really the only solution. But his idea is to at least start with some of the inner suburbs, and if those school districts would be willing to accept some students. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a pretty bold idea. The idea, too, of a bipartisan board is interesting, but I think at this stage that it's been presented, I'm not exactly sure where it stands at this point. Mm-hmm. I don't know if there's been any. I know there hasn't been any votes on any of the aspects of it at this point.
Mm-hmm. The idea of deconcentration of poverty. Dan Dermosich, who's been on this program a couple of times in the Coalition for Justice and Education, has been calling for that for years. Bill Calla, who was the former interim superintendent, almost had a plan in place.
Yes.
with I believe it was with Nazareth,
Mm-hmm.
but that died on the vine.
Mm-hmm.
They point to other examples that has worked in Raleigh, North Carolina, but they have one county and one city, and it worked. It was much more possible there. The idea of a bipartisan election for school board. It seemed to me that this last election cycle, the Democratic primary was more open than most have been. I know your paper and the Democrat and Chronicle promoted a number of candidates. We see the rise of, for example, Mary Adams this time. Mm-hmm. She came almost out of nowhere, and it seemed that she wasn't a party favorite, nor in fact was Van White a party favorite, and yet he won by a lot. It seems like it is approaching that candidates who perhaps before wouldn't have made it, now, it was a very robust election, I think.
It was in some respects. I think that Mary is a very interesting candidate, and she was a very interesting candidate from those days, and her contribution on the board she's a very strong board member. Mm-hmm. And I think your comment about their independence is what I think makes them most interesting, because they do have they obviously have people who support them, but they aren't really I wouldn't say immediately party favorites. They really are more independent, mm-hmm. and hopefully that gives them a little bit more leeway. Mm-hmm. We'll have to see.
Yeah. In the city, though, you really need to be a Democrat.
Yeah, yes. true.
Yes. Okay. You said at the end of that review that several members of the board have opposed some of these measures in the past and that there were financial limitations. But you also said, and this got my attention, you said that some would argue that the board lacked the political will to make some of these changes. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think that the idea of trying to move students, there's so much history with that, and it's a very, very sensitive issue. So busing, exactly. So that one alone is a difficult one to implement, because you not only have to have the community that's receiving the students comfortable with that idea, but you also have to have the parents of the students that are being moved. Mm-hmm. And so it's to even attempt it or to approach it sometimes could be politically risky for the person who tries to do it. I think that's probably the most volatile, mm-hmm. but also could be the one that could be the most rewarding in the end.
Okay, one last question about that article. You also said at the end that White will have to convince at least 4 board members to act on some of his ideas, which may not be easy. Which of the board members seem most likely to align philosophically with White and be willing to vote with him?
Well, the board is kind of this, Malik actually has this saying that he'll use frequently, and it takes, at least 4 members of the board to get to a majority. So you have to have 4 votes, or nothing happens. And
so you would need 3 then, plus him.
Yes. Okay. Yes. So in this particular instance, there are some aspects of that resolution of his document, rather, his revolution there, that I think that you would find consensus on quite a few of them. But there might be others that it would be difficult to build consensus on. Mm-hmm. And there used to be kind of a strong alignment between Willa Powell, Van, Malik, and I think it's still there, but it moves a little bit more at this point mm-hmm. than it did in the past. Mm-hmm. So I think it's going to always be sort of individual issues.
Mm-hmm. For example, one of your most recent interviews was with Willa Powell, and how she, that was in the Democratic Chronicle, how she supported help for mothers.
Yes,
who were in,
teen mothers.
Teen mothers. Uh-huh. And she appears to be one of the few on the board who support that, because it appears to be out of the bailiwick of K-12 education. And so I guess there'll be issues, as you say.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to stop talking about that article, and we're going to go to another article that you wrote. And this is an interview, a long interview, the cover story, called Vargas's Grand Plan for the Rochester City School District. One of the advantages of a weekly newspaper is that you can have the luxury of publishing long interviews. And there's a lot of meat in here. We'll talk about it right after the break. Don't go away. Welcome back to Spotlight on Schools. We're talking with Louis Macaluso, writer for the City newspaper, and we're going to talk about the interview with, I'm told it's pronounced Bohan Vargas. I always pronounced it Bolgan Vargas, even when I interviewed him. However, the title of it was Vargas's Grand Plan for the Rochester City School District. You wrote a long introduction on this in which you highlighted some of his, 6 of his basic ideas as part of his grand plan. Here they are. 1, to reach out to the parents, politicians, and the community. Particularly, he focused on the community. 2, a balanced diet of academics, art, music, and sports to mimic suburban schools. 3, longer school days. Next, attention to attendance, particularly the problem of truancy, and right now, particularly in the lower grades. Next, improvement of record keeping, and finally, reading proficiency by the 3rd grade. What stands out to you on that list?
Well, I think the things that stand out the most are, there's no question that issues like truancy, I've been covering truancy for a long time, but reading proficiency and truancy were 2 issues that that Vargas has brought right up to the forefront, and he's tried to say to the community, look at, we can talk about graduation rates until the cows come home, but unless students are in school, they're not going to graduate. And unless they're able to read at a third grade proficiency when they're in third grade, they're not going to graduate either. Or they're going to struggle.
They'll never catch up.
They'll never catch up, exactly. And everything, reading is the foundation for everything. So, and one of the things that I think that the community probably has a harder time appreciating is that while this is happening, Vargas and every superintendent in the state now has to usher in a much tougher curriculum than what we've had in the past.
The core curriculum,
The core
yes.
curriculum is something that the state agreed to with 45 other states. It is raising the standards. You might remember that we had a high school diploma, a capacity for a high school diploma. We don't have that anymore. Students have to pass all 5 Regents exams in order to graduate.
To get a Regents
To
diploma.
get a
high
Regents
school
diploma.
diploma was local.
Was local, but that doesn't exist anymore. So all students. So when the graduation rate was given in the past, it could include those high school diplomas, but it doesn't. That's gone away. So he's had to do this at this time when the curriculum is actually getting more difficult for students, and I would say the extended hours or expanded hours is a little bit is borrowing a little bit from the charter schools, and it's one of the aspects of the charter schools that seems to be more successful. It plays into the community very well because a lot of students in the city go home or have that time period after school when there's maybe nobody around. Parents are working or the student is alone by themselves. And it's also a time where they could do a lot of work that they might not otherwise do if somebody isn't giving them that kind of parental oversight.
And it's also a time when they can perhaps take advantage of that art, music, sports.
Exactly. They can have those kinds of activities that if you're in a suburban household, it's very possible that mom and dad can afford to give you some of those types of things, take you out to the soccer game, all that kind of stuff. And city students sometimes don't have those privileges or those advantages. And so he's focused on these things that are on one. It's kind of a push-pull in a way. It's sort of trying to make school much more attractive and much more equitable, and at the same time hold the community and parents to a certain bar, saying, you've got to get your kid to school. They have to be in that seat. And I think that those are the things that have been interesting about his first year or the beginning of his time.
One of the statistics that I read that really surprised me, that the greatest truancy rate was not in the higher grades, it was in kindergarten.
Yeah. I was surprised by that too. I think that one of the things that we tend to forget that we make allowances for our illnesses and things like that, and we don't realize that those are the formative years and those are the foundation years. And so, they talk about if a student has missed more than, like 15 to 18 days, they're really starting to fall behind. And it takes resources to bring that student back into the fold.
Yes, you wrote a long story on Mrs. Hooper in the pre-K program.
Yes.
That reflects that. Okay, let's move on. The next thing that one of the things he talked about was getting the community involved. One of the biggest examples that he's talked about is that community involvement at the Northeast, where is it? The Northeast Prep?
Yes, Northeast College Prep.
What is the present status of that? That was kind of a rough going. He wanted 80 volunteers. He's got 20.
The number of volunteers it's been controversial. It has been controversial, and at the same time, I think you have to take into context a couple of things. One is that when the district is trying to train volunteers for something very specific like this, I actually met with one of the people who actually works with the volunteers a number of times, and volunteers come in all different types, and they come in with all of their abilities and some of their weaknesses too. That person has to fit into a certain time schedule. Maybe they're only available on certain days. So it's trying to bring a lot of pieces together. And that's one of the things that we were kind of, when Mariana and I met with Bohan at one point about extended hours, that we were sort of concerned because there's so many balls in the air. Mm-hmm. And also, one of the things that goes with this is that there are certain things that volunteers can do, and then there are certain things that only teachers or certified personnel can do. Mm-hmm. So putting all of those elements together and making it work is hard. It's really, really hard. At the same time, I think that if they keep going, and if they can make the expanded hours actually work, so that it works both academically as well as just socially, it could make a very big difference. Mm-hmm. And he is expanding it to, I think it's 10 other schools in the coming school year. Mm-hmm. It may actually even be more than that, because he does seem to have support from Governor Cuomo in terms of funding for it, because that's the other aspect of it.
At the same time, we're talking about a deficit that may go from $35 to $44 million. So we'll see. I told you this half hour would go fast, and we're about out of time.
I know.
You also have, your paper has an online presence. Can you tell us what that website is?
Yes, it's www.rochestercitynews.com, and you should definitely check it out. We have a lot of followers. We're always tweeting. That's one of the great things about media at this particular time, is that it's not just about print, it's about so many different things. And we have, as writers, we have a lot of opportunities to speak to people in different ways than we ever did in the past. Okay. So it's exciting.
Yeah.
Well,
thank you
so
for joining
much.
us.
Thank you so much.
We've been talking with Tim Macaluso, a staff writer for City Newspaper. You can pick it up at lots of places. It's free. Okay, tune in next month again for another episode of Spotlight on Schools. Good night.
Let's go!